Going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for your patience. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Elizabeth Rossi, and I am Director of Strategic Initiatives at Civil Rights Corps. We really hope that tonight's presentation on the American money bail system will be both interesting and informative. First, I want to note that if you'd like to use the closed captioning, it's available on tonight's webinar. You just need to turn it on. And if you have any logistical or technical issues with that or anything else tonight, please just feel free to let the hosts know in the chat box and we'll try to help you out. I first want to give you a quick preview of tonight's program. We are going to start with a presentation by my colleagues, Kia Duggins and Alora Israni. They're going to share some information about the history. I apologize. Actually, we are going to start with a reflection by Imani and Mfalme Shu'la. And after Imani's reflection, then we'll move to the presentation that my colleagues, Kia Duggins and Alora, will share on the history and the harms of the cash bail system, and also about the incredible organizing and advocacy being done by folks like Imani to challenge pretrial detention around the country. I also just wanted to flag that throughout the presentation, we'll share both general information, and then we'll use the bail system in Harris County, Texas, where Houston is, as an in-depth case study, but there are a lot of jurisdictions we could have chosen. I just wanted to give folks a preview that there'll be some extra information about Harris County tonight. After the presentation, you will have an opportunity to ask the panelists questions. So please, send those questions throughout the presentation to the Q&A in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible, either during the presentation or after. We'll make sure to direct them to the best person. Also wanted to just let you know, we have a 2-hour program plan, and we don't have a scheduled formal break, but please do feel free to take any comfort or stretch breaks that you need. We know it's, the evening, so do whatever you need to do. And then lastly, the program will be recorded and available for sharing after tonight. So for friends or colleagues who weren't able to be here, you can, we'll send around a link that you can then distribute further. So without further preliminaries, I'd love to introduce Imani. Imani Mfalme Shu'la is a freedom fighter and organizer in Knoxville, Tennessee. Imani is the lead organizer of Community Defense of East Tennessee, a nonprofit participatory defense organization that challenges unfair bail systems and supports those facing pretrial detention. Imani is also a national participatory defense network trainer through Silicon Valley Debug. And we've asked Imani to, as a bit of a grounding exercise for tonight, share a little bit about the work that Imani does and her organization. So without further ado, I'll just turn it over to you. Thank you, Imani, so much for being here with us.
Thank you all for having me. I'm glad to be here tonight. So as she said, I am a participatory defense organizer. And some of you may think, what is that? This is an organizing model where we take the power of family and community, organizing and activism, and we move that energy into the courtrooms. This has been really effective when it comes to recognizing the holes in the bail system. When you're working directly with families, you're exposed to the trends and the things that multiple people are going through. And that's what we used to fuel our bail campaign and our work. It came actually from our families. When you're fighting bail, sometimes it seems like this massive thing, but when you start to dissect it family by family, they give you the fuel you need. They give you the stories you need to personalize it. And you can fight from that aspect. And then you fight with those families because it's impacting them. We don't fight for them, we fight with them. We use tactics that a lot of storytelling tactics. We amplify the voices of people who are still incarcerated because of bail only. And we'll record a phone call and we'll make that public. We use a lot of tactics during COVID. We did reports. We did, what our jail would look like without people incarcerated by bail, like how the numbers would drop. We also created reports, and that really impacted our city as far as how they treated bail during COVID. And then we pushed to have those orders permanent. They did a COVID order. And I don't know if later I should talk about some of those organizing things, or this is the space right now.
I think that was great, Imani, and I think we'll have a chance to get to all of that after. So I think that was perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
With that, we'll just move on to the presentation. As I mentioned, this will be led by Alora Israni and Kia Duggins. Alora is an attorney at Civil Rights Corps. She litigates in support of movements to abolish police, prosecutors, and the prison industrial complex. She's currently working on cases challenging pretrial detention in Maryland and Tennessee and police abuse in Washington, D.C. Kia is also an attorney at Civil Rights Corps and is currently working on cases challenging pretrial detention and police abuse in Texas and Washington, D.C., and also works with organizers, including Imani, to end pretrial detention in Tennessee. And I'll just turn it over to the two of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Beth. I'm going to share the presentation that we have for you all. Kia and I are both excited to be here tonight to share this material and this work with you. We have to give credit to Beth and to a number of other people on our team, Ben and Cheryl and Tara, for putting this together. But yeah, we're here today to talk about bail. What is it and how does it affect us? So I think one of the most important things for us to start with is the history of bail, and to remind ourselves that it didn't always used to be this way. The word bail actually means release. And so when you hear someone say, they got bail, it means they were released while they were awaiting trial. The quote up on the screen is a quote from a Supreme Court case that was decided 35 years ago called United States v. Salerno. And in that case, the court said, in our society, liberty is the norm and detention prior to trial is the carefully limited exception. This is, depending on how you ask, a constitutional standard or something to strive for. But unfortunately, it's not actually how things work in this country today, as some of you may know. The current state of bail nationwide is dire. Over 10 million people are admitted to local jails every year. And the vast majority of those people are in jail pre-trial. They are awaiting adjudication of their criminal case. They haven't been convicted of anything. So that's about 547,000 people detained in local jails every day. And the vast majority of those people haven't been convicted of anything. They're just waiting for their case. That's not counting an additional about 64,000 people a day who are waiting in the federal system. And since 2000, the vast majority of the growth in jail populations, again, has been people awaiting pretrial. So 95% of the growth is people who haven't been convicted of anything, which is terrible for a lot of reasons. And it's also very expensive. The United States spends about $13.5 billion every year incarcerating people who haven't been convicted of anything. So how does bail work? As I said earlier, bail means release. Cash bail or money bail is this idea that you have to pay an amount of money in order to be released pre-trial. The way that this has ended up working in practice is that If you can afford to buy your freedom, you are released awaiting trial. And if you can't afford to buy your freedom, you sit in jail. Typically, when people are arrested, they'll come before, a lot of people don't even see a judge. They'll come before some sort of county employee. There's a preset bail schedule where your bail is determined based on not how much money you have or how much is sufficient to make sure you return to court, but just a preset amount based on the offense that you're charged with, not convicted of, just charged with. And if you can happen to pay that arbitrary amount of money, you go free. If you can't pay that amount of money, you stay in jail for the days or weeks or months or years it takes for your case to be adjudicated. Having this, an ability to pay determination, actually getting to see a judge and have that judge, decide how much you can afford to pay and how much is necessary to ask you to pay, that's very, very rare. Most of the time, it's purely a matter of wealth. Paying money up front for release is a recent development. Money bail was not a thing for the majority of American history. The American colonies got their bail system from England. England, going back to the 1100s, 1,000 years ago, vast majority of people were released on a promise to appear. When the American colonies were started, same thing, vast majority of people released on a promise to appear. Sometimes they would use what's called a personal surety, which is a system where basically a person in the community, a friend, a family member, someone else vouches for you and says, I will make sure this person comes to court. In roughly 1900, we see the advent actually of what's called commercial sureties. Commercial sureties, as opposed to personal sureties, are the act of paying a for-profit company to secure your release. So we've all heard of the bail bonds industry. Instead of having a friend or family member show up and vouch for you, you have a commercial bail bonds company that you pay. And the system grew largely as a result of American colonial expansion, as people were moving farther and farther out into what people were calling the frontier. There were fewer communities who could hold each other accountable and be there for each other. And so this commercial industry popped up. And today, there are only 2 countries in the world that have a for-profit bail industry, the US and the Philippines. That's it, 2 countries. The last thing I'll say about this is that this is really, even though this industry popped up more than 100 years ago, it's really exploded in recent decades. Between 1990 and 2009, so 30 years, the proportion of people who are arrested for a felony and who had to pay an amount of money to be released pre-trial exploded from 37% to 61%. The amount that people had to pay also doubled in that time. And that's led to a system today where more than 70% of felony arrestees have to pay $5,000 or more to get out. So if you have $5,000, you can go home. If you don't, you sit in jail. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kia to talk about the harms of pretrial detention.
Thank you, Alora. And thank you all for being here today. So when we think about what makes us feel safe and free, we might think about things like the ability to spend time with our friends and family, access to healthcare, a happy and stable home, access to education, access to fulfilling work, the ability to travel and rest, and things like that. And because we all want to feel safe and free, people sometimes will look to the criminal legal system for safety and for harm reduction. But unfortunately, the criminal legal system often causes harm. So I will provide some examples in the following slides about how pretrial detention and our money bail system separates human beings from the things that make us safe and free. Next slide, please. So the first thing I would like to talk about is how pretrial detention causes people to lose their jobs and housing. When people are jailed, even for just a few days, they're at risk of losing their jobs. If you lose your job, you lose your income, and your housing is threatened as well because you can't pay your rent or your mortgage. This sets off a cycle of jailing and poverty that can be nearly impossible to get out of. Pretrial detention is an enormous cost to individuals and to the communities where they're incarcerated. As I said earlier, one of the things that makes a lot of people feel safe and free is access to a stable and happy home, and also access to work that fulfills them. And pretrial detention and money bail can interrupt those things. So 23% of people who are incarcerated pretrial lose their housing as a result of their pretrial detention. That's almost 1 in 4 people. And arrestees who are not initially released are 9.4% less likely to be normally employed after. And if you think about it, it's because when you're in a cage, you can't go to work, it's difficult to call your employer and explain your situation. And also, while you're in a cage, it's difficult to pay rent and to pay your mortgage. And so pretrial detention has the effect of separating people from their housing and their jobs, which makes them ultimately less safe. Next slide, please. So I would also like to talk about how pretrial detention separates families. Pretrial detention doesn't only affect the person who's incarcerated, it affects whole families and communities. Empirical evidence as well as lived experience show that the incarceration of a loved one has immense impacts on a person's, and especially a child's, social, emotional, and economic outcomes. It's, once again, one of the things that makes us feel safe and free, and maybe the main thing that makes a lot of people feel safe and free, is their ability to spend time with their loved ones and their ability to spend time with their children if they have them. And pretrial detention separates people from their children and separates people from their loved ones. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2010, more than 4 in every 10 incarcerated fathers are Black and incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white people. So the impact of this is that Black children and Black families are being separated by pretrial detention. And this is devastating because, once again, having an incarcerated parent has dramatic social, emotional, and economic consequences for the children. You can imagine if you were a child with a loving parent and you were waiting for your parent to come home, that it would be devastating if suddenly they did not because they were in pretrial detention. It would also be devastating, as you can imagine, to be a parent who's held in a cage and cannot hug, take care of, or explain things to their child. So pretrial detention and money bail causes harm by separating families. Next slide, please. Cash bail exacerbates many racial disparities, which I touched on a little bit in the last slide, but will expand upon here. The bail system is a system of wealth-based detention, and therefore it exacerbates the racial wealth gap. Bail determinations themselves are also racist, with Black arrestees receiving higher bail amounts than white arrestees. Because of the racial wealth gap, Black people, white people, and the Latinx community come to the criminal legal system with very different sets of resources on average. So as a result, the likelihood that a person who is not white will be stuck in jail due to inability to pay money bail is far greater than for white people. Additionally, racism results in higher bail amounts being set for people who are not white, even for the same charges. Next slide, please. So the culmination of everything I'm saying here is that cash bail makes communities less safe. Secured money bail is ineffective at assuring reappearance or keeping communities safe. Numerous studies show that money bail does not increase court appearance rates, and it actually leads to higher rates of future interpersonal violence. It also causes more people experience violence and neglect while they're in the jail, which I will talk about more a little bit later. The bail system is purportedly designed to serve two purposes: to ensure that defendants make court dates and to keep the community safe. However, cash bail does neither. A study of unsecured bonds showed that unsecured bonds were as effective as secured bonds at ensuring court appearance. So once again, thinking about the harm reduction framework, studies have shown that cash bail actually, because it destabilizes people's lives, separates them from their housing, their jobs, and their families, makes communities less safe than releasing people and allowing them to get back to their housing and their jobs and their families, and to contribute to society until the government can present evidence in their case. So as a point or a statistic that illustrates that point is that compared to individuals released within 24 hours of arrest, low-risk defendants held 2 to 3 days were 17% more likely to commit another crime within 2 years. Detention periods of 4 to 7 days yielded a 35% increase in reoffense rates. And defendants detained for 8 to 14 days were 51% more likely to recidivate than defendants who were detained for less than 24 hours. So all of those statistics show that cash bail is actually increasing the harm that's done to individuals and communities and not doing its job of keeping us safe. Cash bail also contributes to mass incarceration. Oh, sorry, thank you for switching to the next slide for me, Alora. By putting people in jail before conviction and coercing guilty pleas and longer sentences, pretrial detention is a major driver of mass incarceration. So to zoom out and take a couple of steps back for a minute, we have to remember that when people are detained pre-trial, that means that the government is putting them in a cage with little to usually no evidence that that person has actually committed a crime in the first place. And so when somebody is in a cage with little to no evidence that they've committed a crime, they're waiting for trial. They're waiting for the government to present evidence. And while they're in the cage waiting for their trial, they cannot pay their rent or their mortgage. They cannot take care of their children or hug their children or comfort their children. They cannot go to their job. And so for a lot of people, even when they are innocent, the catastrophic effects of waiting for a trial in a cage makes them plead guilty, even if they're innocent, just so that they can get out. Some statistics that illustrate this is that the US has only 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of the world's prisoners, which is the highest rate of human caging in any society in the recorded history of the modern world. Despite this, the US is not necessarily safer than other countries that don't incarcerate people as much, which once again brings us back to the question of harm reduction and shows us that money bail and pretrial detention not only fails to reduce harm, but actually causes harm to both individuals and communities. Next slide, please. So cash bail systems waste money. In addition to the massive and catastrophic human costs of pretrial detention, it's also very expensive and fiscally irresponsible. Incarceration makes communities less prosperous, and the money spent to incarcerate people could be spent to build actual community safety. So once, as we touched on a little bit earlier, somebody is incarcerated, they can't go to their job, so that makes communities less prosperous. And then additionally, the just massive amount of money that the United States spends on pretrial detention could be used on other things. So a study that illustrates this. One study estimates that eliminating money bail could increase the aggregate United States income by up to $80.9 billion a year. So that's billions of dollars that the United States could have by reinvesting money away from pretrial detention and into the things that keep us safe that I've mentioned earlier, such as housing, healthcare, education, and programs for children. Next slide. So jails are dangerous and unhealthy places. In addition to, once again, not reducing harm, jails cause a lot of harm to individuals who are in those jails. And it's important to remember that people who are incarcerated pre-trial have not been convicted of a crime yet. So this is giving the government the ability to inflict assault and illness upon people without any evidence that the person has committed a crime. Money bail and pretrial detention force millions of people into jails, which are unsafe, unhealthy, and miserable places. Almost 1 in 30 people in jail were sexually assaulted within the previous 12 months of incarceration. And jails are notorious sources of infection and disease, lacking adequate resources for addressing health needs, which is something that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, where people in jails and prisons contracted COVID at rates of 5 to 6 times that of outside populations. Next slide, please. Pretrial detention also kills people. Many people, at least that we know of, 1,200 people per year die in jail, and that is most likely an undercount. 2019 is the most recent year for which we have national data, but even with that data, government officials have said that it's probably an undercount because it's very difficult to know what's going on in jails and how people are being treated due to bureaucracy and intentional deflection. So the reasons that people die in jails for the most part are because they don't have adequate medical care, because of overcrowding and poor conditions, because of abuse and neglect, like I mentioned in the last slide, and because of high rates of untreated mental illnesses that lead to suicide and death in the jail. So again, it's important to note that pretrial detention causes harm and even death on individuals and communities. Next slide, please. So a case study to illustrate one of these points is in Harris County, Texas. So I'm one of the attorneys on Civil Rights Corps' bail class action case in Harris County. And Harris County is one place where there has been a devastating rise in custody deaths and reports of violence in the jail. This case study illustrates how the money bail system perpetuates harm and separates human beings from the things that keep them safe and free, like housing, healthcare, education, employment, and the ability to spend time with loved ones. Next slide, please. So I have some stories to share from people in Harris County to illustrate what human beings are going through in pretrial detention. These are just a few stories that demonstrate the overwhelming neglect, abuse, violence, and death that people experience in jail simply because they can't afford to buy their freedom. So the first story, we're using people's initials to protect their privacy, is about MS. MS was on pretrial probation and was pregnant with twins when she was arrested for an alleged new felony offense. She couldn't afford the $80,000 bond required for her release, so she was stuck in jail simply because she could not afford a money bail amount. Beginning in June 2022, this woman faced extreme abuse from guards and other inmates. She was given blankets covered in feces, detained in a cell with non-working air vents, and in a cell that was infested with bed bugs. She was taken to the hospital and learned that she had miscarried one of her twins, but the baby was not removed from her body and she was sent back to the jail. She was also sexually assaulted by multiple women in her cell. About 10 days later, she was taken to the hospital, sedated, and then offered a form to sign. And when she woke up, she learned that her second twin had been aborted without her consent. After she was transported back to the jail, she wasn't provided with any pads or anything to clean herself for hours. She attempted suicide. And during all of this, on August 30th, the new case that resulted in her arrest was dismissed, and she was placed back on probation for her old cases. She was finally released after midnight on September 1st. So that is just one story of a person in the Harris County Jail whose criminal charges were ultimately dismissed, but who suffered unspeakable violence and unspeakable despair while detained in a cage. And the only reason she was in that cage is because she couldn't afford the money bail set in her case. There are several other stories where people are put into retaliatory lockdowns, denied mental and physical health care, and other horrors that people experience simply because they cannot afford a money bail. Next slide, please. So every day in the Harris County Jail is a result of policy choices made by the Texas legislature, the Harris County felony judges, local police and sheriffs, and the district attorney, Kim Ogg. Many people who have died in the jail were in jail only because they couldn't afford to pay bail. Once again, these people have not been convicted of crimes yet. They're just in there because they cannot afford to pay a money amount that a judge set in their case. These deaths are preventable. So I'm gonna talk about a couple of the people who died. We have KS, who supported herself and her 4 children on disability payments before she was arrested. Her bond, she died a month later because she couldn't afford her bond amount, which was lowered to $5,000. We have MS, who is 28 years old and diabetic, and he died because he was poor and was neglected medically by the jail. We also have DL, who we mentioned before, and he died last March. He was charged with misdemeanor and was detained only because he couldn't pay $5,000. So people die in the jail often only because they can't afford the money bail set in their case. Next slide, please. As I spoke about before, bail rips apart families, and we see this in Harris County. The image on the screen is of jail visitation at the Harris County Jail. We see these injustices playing out in Harris County all the time. In Harris County alone, tens of thousands of children are separated from their parents. The sheriff's office estimates that each year, 92,718 children, so almost 100,000 children, have a parent in the Harris County Jail, which is 7% of children in the county. So you can imagine the trauma and the pain that many children and parents are going through simply because people cannot afford the money amount that a judge sets in their case. Next slide, please. Bail leads to coerced guilty pleas, which we have seen in Harris County. People who have been detained pretrial, even when they're innocent, suffer worse case outcomes. They're 25% more likely to plead guilty than similarly situated defendants. This is because, as I mentioned earlier, when you're in a cage and separated from your loved ones and unable to access your housing and unable to access your healthcare and unable to access your education, you might feel that you need to plead guilty just to get back to your life, even if you're innocent. Next slide, please. In Harris County, as we talked about the financial cost of money bail, in Harris County, pretrial detention costs more than $100 million per year. That's more than double what Harris County taxpayers spend every year on public health services, the public library, pollution control, and economic equity programs combined. So again, Harris County is spending more money on putting people in cages than on healthcare, education, environmental justice, and economic justice. Next slide, please. Additionally, the huge amount of money that Harris County is spending on pretrial detention is related to the extraction of wealth from Black and Brown residents. The bail system is really a bail industry. Private companies in the county itself make huge profits off of detained Harris County residents and their families. Residents pay approximately $17 million in non-refundable premiums to commercial bail bondsmen to secure their release in Harris County. Additionally, other people profit off of the phone calls and videos with incarcerated people, and the money that people have to send to a commissary to ensure that their loved ones can get the medical and hygiene care that they need. So commercial bail is taking millions from poor families, regardless of guilt or innocence. Next slide, please. So we might ask, since the bail system is not reducing harm and is making us less safe and is actually causing a lot of harm to people and communities, who is this benefiting? And the answer is that the bail system is benefiting for-profit commercial bail industries, which make millions of dollars, punishment bureaucrats and prosecutors who can use pretrial detention to coerce people to plead guilty and not have to actually work and do trials. Judges, because it saves judges time and makes their lives easier to hold people in cages as opposed to giving people the full trials that they're entitled to, and the wealthy and powerful, because people who can afford money bail can get out of jail, which then gives them more opportunities and enables them in ways that poor people cannot take advantage of. So next slide, please. The last point I'll make is that the Harris County bail reform from a former case that Civil Rights Corps litigated has shown that getting rid of the money bail system and releasing people pre-trial makes us all safer. It leads to smaller jail populations, safer communities, and large savings in county spending. The county is now spending hundreds of millions of dollars on something that has no measurable benefit to the county and significant measurable harms. But studies from our former misdemeanor case that challenged the felony bail or the misdemeanor bail system, shows that people who are released pre-trial do come back, that they usually do not reoffend, and that it has several downstream benefits for the entire community. So to conclude my portion of the presentation, bail, money bail, and our pretrial detention system causes harm to people and communities. And it's important for us to think about what we can do to both preserve people's rights by releasing people pre-trial and also increase safety and reduce harm by ensuring that people have access to the housing, healthcare, education, loved ones that make us all safe and free. Thank you.
Thanks, Kia. So the last section of this, which I'm going to cover, is basically what would a better system look like? How can we imagine and build a better system? And I want to start by just kind of hearkening back to the beginning of this presentation, just to remind us that this idea that you'd have to pay an amount of money to be out of jail pre-trial is relatively new. It's a relatively recent development. It was not always like this. There is a better way, and we should and can be able to get there. I'm going to start with a cautionary tale. So there's a lot of talk right now about bail reform and about what are things that we can do to reform the bail system. But a lot of the reforms that are being talked about don't actually address the root causes of poverty and of white supremacy. and they don't shrink the footprint of the criminal legal system. So you hear about things like, instead of detaining people pre-trial, we'll put them on GPS monitoring or home detention. We call that e-carceration. You hear about systems that shift away from money bail, but to a preventative detention system where they say, okay, we're not going to use money, but if you're charged with this list of crimes, then, there's a presumption that you're going to be detained because you're dangerous. We've seen a rise in diversion programs and drug courts and mental health courts. And this all may seem well and good, but the problem is that these systems don't actually shrink the footprint of the criminal legal system. You're not shrinking the government's power or reducing its interference in people's lives. You're not making people freer, and you're not reducing the number of people who come into contact with police, prosecutors, and the prison industrial complex. So that's the question we really want to ask ourselves. How do we reduce the footprint of incarceration? How do we repair the damage that's been done to communities? How do we invest in communities that have been harmed? How do we transfer power out of the for-profit bail industry and the prosecutors and judges and all of the actors that Kia was talking about who benefit from this system? How do we shift it to the communities that have actually been harmed and address these root causes of poverty and of white supremacy? So the federal system tried to do this about 40 years ago. As some of you may know, you can be charged with a crime in state court, but you can also be charged with a federal crime in federal court. And Congress tried to do something about what they called the constitutional crisis of wealth-based detention in the federal system in 1984. So before Congress made this change in 1983, the percentage of people in the federal system who were detained while awaiting trial was about 24%. In 1984, Congress passes what's called the Bail Reform Act. And what the Bail Reform Act did is it tried to limit the use of money bail. It tried to take money out of pretrial detention decisions, which sounds great and is a noble goal. But it actually resulted in a lot more people being detained prior to trial. And the reason for that is that what the Bail Reform Act did was it made a couple of big changes that basically greatly expanded the pool of people eligible for detention. So two of those big changes, one was prior to the act, in deciding whether a person should be released or detained prior to trial, the only thing the court was supposed to consider was, will this person show up in court? What's their likelihood of returning and facing this case? The Bail Reform Act said the court can and must also consider safety to the community. But what safety means, that term was left up to judges to interpret using their own discretion. Obviously, community safety has a ton of very racist and classist implications, and it led to judges just preventively detaining people on the basis of, I think you're a danger to the community. The second thing the Bail Reform Act did is it created a category of what it called violent crimes and created a presumption for detention that said, if you're charged with one of these things, there's a presumption that you're too dangerous to be released, that you need to be detained without any kind of individualized consideration of your circumstances. And all of this led to just a skyrocketing pretrial detention rate in the federal system, which today is nearly 75%. So 3/4 of people who are charged in federal court are incarcerated awaiting trial. So what does real change look like? What is the alternative to this? There are a few elements to it, but the biggest one is extremely limited circumstances in which pretrial detention can and should be used. So limiting the categories of people who are eligible for detention, like in Harris County, for example, where most misdemeanors weren't even eligible for detention, basically limiting the groups of people who a court even has discretion to detain, eliminating profit from the system. The bail bonds industry, as you expect, does a huge amount of lobbying to get money bail to continue because it's very profitable, and that creates incentives that don't always align with people's freedom. So eliminating that aspect of it, implementing very strict standards and procedures in cases where detention is sought. So I'll talk a little bit about this later, but there's this idea that if you're going to be detained awaiting trial, looking back to that Supreme Court quote from the beginning, that's supposed to be a carefully limited exception. So we have to be very careful. We have to consider all possible conditions of release, combinations of conditions. Is there anything we can do that will sufficiently ensure the safety of the community, ensure you'll come back to court that's less restrictive than detention? And if it is, then we have to do those things instead of detaining you. And then the last part is that, like Kia said, incarcerating someone has an effect on that person, but it also has an effect on their family and their community and their children. And so there are states that have changed sentencing laws to account for that, to account for the fact that a person might be a caregiver or a provider or otherwise active in their community, and taking them out of the community is going to harm the community. And so accounting for that in sentencing, and we could do the same with pretrial detention. So a couple of relative success stories. New Jersey and Washington, D.C. have both in recent years changed their pretrial detention laws, and they've severely restricted or eliminated the use of money bail. But on top of that, they've also done some of the things I was talking about. So they have created a presumption of release for the vast majority of people who are arrested and charged with crimes. They require prompt bail hearings. If you are arrested and detained, you have to appear in front of a judge relatively quickly. And that hearing has to be a robust adversarial hearing. You have to be provided defense counsel. The burden is on the state to show that there's no alternatives to detention that will suffice. There have to be findings made on the record so you can appeal. And the adoption of all of these things has, in both New Jersey and DC, vastly decreased the pretrial incarceration rate, while at the same time not making communities any less safe or more violent, and ensuring that the vast majority of people show up to court. So these two purported rationales for the cash bail system, keeping communities safe and ensuring people that show up to court, you can do these things without money bail, without incarcerating pretrial, and by instead giving them supports like community defense and participatory defense. Chicago is another example. The chief judge in Chicago in 2017 issued a standing order, which basically said you can't use money to detain a person pretrial. If you're going to impose money bail, you have to do a very robust ability to pay hearing, and you have to figure out, what's an amount of money that this person can actually afford. But you can't, set a bond that a person can't afford as a means of keeping them detained. Basically, you can't tell a person who doesn't have any money that you can get out if you pay $1 million, because that's the same as detaining them. And again, when Chicago did this, it saw a reduction in the jail population and also a reduction in what is defined as violent crime. So how do we get there? There are many levels of change. There are many ways to change things. And it is Civil Rights Corps' belief, and my belief, that it's important to use all of these tools in context. There's no one tool that's kind of a silver bullet that's gonna change everything. And the last part of this presentation is I'm just going to talk about a few of these things and how they can possibly help affect change in the pretrial detention context. So litigation, I'm a litigator. I litigate bail cases at Civil Rights Corps, and litigation has a role to play. When we sue jurisdictions that have what we allege to be unconstitutional bail systems, it can be a useful tool in advancing decarceral goals. But I think it's also important to remember that change is never going to come solely or completely from lawyers and from courts. Real change is going to come from lawyers taking court judgments and working in concert with communities, with public defenders, with court watchers, with community organizers, to actually create change. So two of the cases up here, Torres v. Collins and Allison v. Allen, these were both Civil Rights Court cases. Torres is in Tennessee, Allison is in North Carolina. In both of these cases, the plaintiffs, represented by Civil Rights Corps, won basically orders from the federal court saying, the bail systems, there need to be processes, there need to be standards. This is what it needs to look like. And all of that is well and good, but it had to be enforced, right? And if there aren't mandatory categorical rules about, a judge flat out cannot detain someone if X, Y, and Z is true, and if instead the judge is being told by the federal court, you need to use your discretion, you need to employ these processes, there actually have to be people there enforcing that and holding the courts accountable for that to make any of a difference. And so Civil Rights Corps has had success, for example, training public defenders and helping public defenders write motions to challenge things in their clients' individual cases if the federal court's order is not being followed. In one case, for example, instead of basically processing people through using a bail schedule where they don't actually get in front of a court, the federal court said, no, you have to do a bail hearing, it has to be adversarial. And public defenders were able to use this to basically time out the system. The prosecutors and the state courts didn't have the time and resources to do these bail hearings for everybody who they wanted to detain. And so they had to release some people because they, just didn't have the resources to follow the procedures. And defense attorneys have also successfully appealed state trial level bail determinations up to state appellate courts, again, using the word of the federal court about what the Constitution requires. The second tactic I'm going to talk about is organizing. I think organizing is kind of a broad term and it's not always well understood, but all organizing means is really just bringing communities together who have a shared goal and working together to put pressure on decision makers to make change. Organizing is sometimes national, but it's often very local. It's very much, in your own backyard. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of organizing tactics that have worked. So some of you may have heard bail funds. This is basically an idea that a community can pool its resources and can bail out people who are held on money bail amounts that they can't personally afford. And also at the same time, provide supportive services. So when you bail people out, you help, make sure they have housing and employment and childcare and all the things that they need to show up to court. So for example, the Envision Freedom Fund in New York paid for 5,000 people to be free over the course of 5 years from money bails amounts that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to pay. At the same time, they worked with court watchers and public defenders to pressure policymakers to push a big bail reform law in New York, which I'll talk about at the end. But now they've pivoted and they pay bail for people who are in immigration detention, and they also redirect money to other organizing and policy campaigns. The other organizing method I'll talk about is participatory defense. So Imani talked about this at the beginning, but participatory defense is this idea that basically the community can show up for each other and show up to court and court watch and keep an eye on what's going on, and also support people who are released pre-trial with housing and employment and resources like that to get them through their felony, get them through their criminal case. So this is a graphic from an organization called Silicon Valley Debug, which does participatory defense in Santa Clara County, California. On the left, you see, without the involvement of participatory defense, in about 85% of cases, the pre-printed bail amount on the bail schedule was imposed, and if the person had the money, they could pay it, and if they didn't have the money, then they sat in jail. Silicon Valley Debug came in and piloted a community release project where, when people got out, they connected them with housing and employment and other resources to help them keep their lives together and show up to court. And in a pilot of 100 cases, 100 felony cases, they increased the rate of release from 9% to 37%. So it's the 37% you see on the right, just by providing people the support they need. Similarly, the program that Imani started in Knoxville, Community Defense in East Tennessee, has done court watching and participatory defense work and led to a 40% reduction in the Knoxville, jail population. The last thing I'll talk about is policy. So, when we say policy, we basically mean pressuring policymakers to change our laws to make them more just and fair. And the best bail policies that we have seen passed are the ones that focus on not just eliminating money bail, which is important, but also providing people voluntary supports like court reminders, stuff like that, to help them show up to court. And this has led to an increase in people showing up for their court dates without any sort of increase in violence in communities or danger or anything like that. So I mentioned New York. New York had a new bail law go into effect in the beginning of 2020. They eliminated cash bail for many offenses, and they also allowed judges to release more people on their own recognizance, which is just a promise to appear in court, or on non-financial conditions. And they saw the jail population in New York City went down by about 25%. In New York State, it went down by about 30%. And there was no increase in the likelihood that people were getting rearrested. Similarly, in New Jersey, I talked about this a little bit before. New Jersey's bail change went into effect in 2017. And there's actually been a rise in the percentage of people, a slight rise, but a rise in the percentage of people who show up to court. It's about 91%. And the number of people who are incarcerated on a bail amount of less than $2,500 fell from about 1,500 people to 14 people. So there are models for this, and CRC has actually drafted a model bill. It's called the CRC Pretrial Release and Detention Act, that just shows one approach to, what a system that moves beyond cash bail and prioritizes physical liberty could look like. And that's available on our website for anyone who wants to read it. And our policy department is also happy to talk to people about it. And that's it. Thank you so much that's it for this part of the program, I should say. Thank you so much. And I will turn it back to Beth.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Kia, for that incredibly rich and informative presentation. Before we sort of shift to the Q&A portion of this evening, Civil Rights Corps' former poet in residence, Faylita Hicks, is going to share a poem they wrote specifically for this evening. By way of background, CRC believes that one of the ways that our criminal system is able to accomplish some of the horrors of the mass human caging system that you've heard about tonight is by erasing the stories of people who are directly impacted by these injustices. Since 2009, CRC has hosted cohorts of artists and poets whose work sheds light on the injustices of the criminal legal system, and we are so honored to have Faylita with us tonight to share their creative gifts and communicate the humanity of people affected by the bail system. Faylita Hicks is a queer Afro-Latinx activist, writer, and interdisciplinary artist. Born in South Central California and raised in Central Texas, they use their intersectional experiences to advocate for the rights of BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ people by interpreting policy's impact on the individual using poetry, music, performance, and digital art. They are the author of Hoodwitch, a finalist for the 2020 Lambda Literary Award for Bisexual Poetry, the forthcoming poetry collection, A Map of My Want, and the debut memoir about their carceral experiences, A Body of Wild Light. Hicks is also the recipient of fellowships and residencies from Black Mountain Institute, the Tony Award-winning Broadway Advocacy Coalition, Civil Rights Corps, Lambda Literary, Texas After Violence Project, Tin House, and the Right of Return USA. Faylita is a 2022 recipient of Art for Justice's New Visions for Shared Safety grant, allowing them to create work that envisions a world without mass incarceration. Hicks is a voting member of the Recording Academy Grammys and the Songwriters and Composers Committee for the Texas chapter. Their poetry, essays, and digital art have been published in or are forthcoming in American Poetry Review, Ecotone, Kenyon Review, Long Reads, Poetry, Slate, Texas Observer, the Slowdown Podcast, Yale Review, among others. Their personal account of their time in pretrial incarceration in Hayes County, Texas, is featured in the ITVS Independent Lens 2019 documentary, 45 Days in a Texas Jail, and the Brave New Films 2021 documentary, narrated by Mahershala Ali, Racially Charged, America's Misdemeanor Problem. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Faylita. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Can you all hear me? Can I get a thumbs up? Just to make sure everything's, thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, Elizabeth. All right. It's always hard to have other people read my bio because I'm like, that thing is long now, but because of the particular topic we're talking about, I want to explain that my incarceration almost kept me from being able to create. It almost kept me from moving forward in life. And so I am very proud of what's been able to happen since then. This poem is a poem that was written after receiving a lot of the information you just saw today in the presentation, and I'll have more comments later during the Q&A, but I'm just gonna read it the way I would if I was performing it. Right, so this poem is called Harris County Renames the Death Penalty to Bail. The 8th Amendment says that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. But according to Harris County, excessive bail shall be required, excessive fines imposed, cruel and unusual punishments inflicted on the people until they succumb. The county's commandments shall require safety officers to not recognize the people as people, but recognize the people instead as criminals. All of the imperfect people, the hungry people, the people in crisis, the houseless people, the parent people, the poor people, the sick people, we, the people, shall hereby be defined henceforth as cash. An overflow of dividends, different ends, ripe strange fruit, freshly picked from 3 blanched branches, a surplus of stamped out notes, thin, extremely flammable promises of equity, freshly repainted dogma, now available for exchange. Stocks and bonds. We, the people, shall be noted as stocks and bonds, pounds and pounds of sick, wild black Angus, ushered into the deteriorating cattle chutes of Harris County Sheriff's Office, squeezed into the bankrolls and calendars of big belt and buckled robe-wearing wranglers, whipping into line and hustle our kith and kin. We shall be noted as sweet buttered bodies set to the grill for the governor's next picnic, a liquid asset leaking out into the press, a consciousness seizing anxious under the head of their captive bolt, whatever bleeds when opinion changes. We shall be noted as investments in public safety. A faltering hologram of the country post somebody else's peace-driven reformation, a long-standing agreement between the legislators and residents to always keep themselves first centered, secondly entertained. 40 acres. 40 mules to an acre, we the people shall under the law, in the name of justice, be fined more than our annual salary, be forced to carry in the womb, even after the womb is forcibly emptied, be forced into closets before it is known whether we are innocent or guilty, be charged with sleeping, be charged with eating, be charged with breathing, and expected to pay in cash, card, or blood. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faylita. Just gives me chills. I really appreciate your sharing your incredible work with us tonight. At this point, we're going to turn things to the Q&A portion, and my colleague, Ben Perlmutter, is going to lead us there. So I will turn the floor over to Ben to facilitate questions for our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. And thank you, Faylita, for that really beautiful and moving poem. The rest of the evening, we have dedicated to a question and answer session. People should feel free to ask questions to Faylita, to Imani, who opened the presentation that earlier this evening, and to Kia and Alora about their presentation. If you have a question for any of the panelists, please feel free to put it. You should have a little button that says Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and you can click on that and enter your question, and I can field them to the panelists. I am not sure that we'll be able to get to all the questions that are asked tonight, but we'll try to answer as many as possible. And if we don't get to you, we can try to follow up after the event. And again, this event is recorded, and we'll be able to share it after the fact. So please, again, feel free to put any questions in the Q&A box. And again, thanks so much for being here. Just to start, we have a question for Imani. We obviously heard Alora talk a little bit more about organizing efforts and participatory defense in particular. To start, can you just talk a little bit about how CDET began and how you got involved in participatory defense?
Yes, thank you. So going back, participatory defense was created by families in San Jose, California, with the organization Debug. What they found was while they were fighting injustices in the street, they lost power in the courtroom. So they developed that organizing model to take that organizing power and activism into the courtroom. After so many years of them perfecting that model, they decided to share it with other people. And fortunately for us, we had a head public defender at that time that went to a presentation and brought that training to Knoxville. Community members just attended that training, and they asked, do we feel like this is something that Knoxville wanted? About 10 of us said yes, and that's when community defense was formed. What was the second part? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was great. The other part of the question was just talking about how you got involved in participatory defense in the first place.
So as a directly impacted person, as I was sitting there in the training, I realized if I had this knowledge and these tools, that the outcome of my case, my family members would have been completely different. I think it's very important to understand that it is called participatory defense, so that you participate in your defense. And with bail, it's very hard to do that. And so that's why it's important for us to fight the system, because when people do actually participate in their defense, they have better outcomes.
Thanks for that, Imani. Yeah, another question that we have for Faylita, I guess similar but in a different vein, what role do you see poetry and art playing in changing systems of oppression, like the cash bail system?
That's a big question. To be honest, I was thinking about something I wanted to share that I don't think many people have thought about, and it's kind of related. Rodney King. Most folks don't know that before the LA riots, there was the Watts riots. The Watts riots was a traffic infraction that turned into the Watts riots. And then Rodney King was a traffic infraction, a misdemeanor traffic infraction that turned into the LA riots, and it was filmed. The difference between the Watts and the Los Angeles riots was the use of a tool like a video camera, and how even the movement for Black Lives and everything that we've seen in the last several decades when it comes to social media's impact on the movement, on the fight for liberation and the fight for abolition, so on and so forth, the use of the cell phone, right? Something that's so small that you wouldn't have sold a cell phone as a tool to fight the system. Like, that's not what you would have thought, but so many people are so interested in documenting their lives that they've begun to document the lives of the people around them as well, and document the smaller circumstances. And I think that's actually where we're seeing the turn happen. You know, some people are like, oh no, things are never going to change. I was like, yeah, but we didn't have evidence before. Now we got evidence. Before it was just stories that we were telling each other, but now we've got videos, and now we've got, and obviously people will interpret videos how they want to, and that's still up for debate. That's the same thing with art, right? I can put up a piece and people will interpret it 8 different ways, but my purpose for sharing it, my statement will always be a part of that context for the original thing. And so even seeing how that's impacting the work that we do is really important to me. I think about Karen Gaines. A lot of people don't know that Karen Gaines was also a traffic infraction. The whole thing that led to her circumstance started as a traffic infraction. And if you go on her Facebook, you will actually find videos of her reading poems. They don't know that George Floyd used to do a little bit of rapping. The artists are not only documenting what's happening and putting it into context, but at heart, that is who we are as this species. We feel the need to express ourselves. We feel the need to share ourselves in all aspects of ourselves. And if anything, I think that when thinking towards liberation, it's really going to be important to not only write about what's hard and what's ugly, and not only document what's hard and what's ugly, but this idea of imagining, what if it didn't look like this? I think it is going to be the artists who are the ones who are really looking at what life is like post mass incarceration. We're the ones who are going to show you what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. We're the ones who are going to try to imagine, no, really, what is the family dynamic like? How do we live our lives day to day? And that's actually the hardest part, is seeing everything ugly happening online, but then me having to make a choice that, nope, today I plan on dancing in the sun, and I'm going to put my feet in grass, and I'm going to do it intentionally, because that is what the future looks like to me post all of this. So I think that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. That was really beautiful. And you were talking about evidence, and speaking of evidence, but maybe in a different vein, we have a question. Access to data about pretrial incarceration is iffy at the local level, and somebody is wondering if you all have examples of best practices for data collection. And if I can just ask a second question about evidence, I guess I'm wondering if, it's true that there's not a lot of great data, and I'm wondering what you all see, and maybe specifically Imani, as the role of court watch programs as a way of gathering more evidence that, not from the state, but from participatory defense organizations and people who are directly impacted. So that's sort of 2 questions in one, and I'll let anybody start an answer to it.
Okay, so you are correct. It is hard to kind of find out that pretrial detention information. We fortunately have made connections with some attorneys who can pull what we call in Knoxville a jail list. You can see kind of who's being held or what percentage of people are being held on pretrial. Also, with court watching, you actively go into the courts and you document who is being held on detention, who is being pretrial released, who is given a bond. That kind of feeds into our work as far as the community release work. But for us, it's a little easier just because we do have that tool. We have the access to the attorneys who have that tool. So in COVID, we knew how many people were in the jail. We knew how many people could come home. And so that's what fueled us to do our push, our COVID release push, which then led to them releasing everyone with a C felony and below. And then we actively pushed to make that a permanent thing for Knox County.
Thank you, Imani. I'll add to that and say, in terms of data, recently in Civil Rights Corps' misdemeanor case in Harris County called O'Donnell, there was a rigorous research done by the University of Pennsylvania about the effects of the misdemeanor bail reform down there. And the long and short of the data is that it found that releasing people pretrial increased public safety and also helped to reduce recidivism. And so we'll be happy to send the link to that study to people who are interested.
Can I say one more thing? When we got that COVID order in place, one of the things we used to fight that, to get that in place, was once they did that COVID order, crime did not increase, right? So we were actually able to use that data to say, you can make this a permanent order and you don't have to go backwards, you can go forward. And so that data actually did come from the DA's office about who may or may not have been rearrested from that release. And I think there were like a few arrests on misdemeanor, like possession charges.
I have a really small comment to add. In San Marcos, one of the things that we did for our city and our county jail was besides a lot of FOIA requests, we literally just set up places for people to tell us their experiences on the side of the street. And so I don't know if that's a potential for your area, but sometimes just asking the community members who wants to get involved or who wants to share their information, either with their names and faces or anonymously, that helped us to get the information that we needed, that we took to some of our partnering organizations to grab that information about what was happening in the county jail pretrial. So I don't know if that was a method.
Thank you all for all of that. We have another question about participatory defense work and organizing within communities specifically. Can you talk about some of the ways that the system has responded to community support and liberatory reforms? The person who asked the question says they know these systems can be flexible and adaptive, and they're wondering about experiences of backlash against organizing within the community.
We've had both negative and positive experiences. It just depends on the moment. We've learned that the moment really counts. So when we were trying to do documentation for bail work and they realized we were in the courtrooms doing that, some of the negative backlash was they actually turned the microphone volume down so that we could not document. In the courtroom, there's all kind of commotion going on at the DA's table. And so you really have to be attentive or upfront to hear. And we were doing that just fine until they realized we were documenting. And so that one thing stopped us from getting the actual correct data that we needed. But they knew we were there. So other counties, surrounding counties, when they saw people that they didn't recognize in court, they were like, oh my goodness, is Civil Rights Corps here watching us? Or, are they watching our bail practices? So that was a positive thing that came out of it as well. But just being present in court can change the outcome of people's bail. When we did our pilot with the public defender's office, if there was someone who went up and let's say they didn't have transportation, the attorney would point and say, well, community defense is here and they will be able to provide that person transportation back and forth to court. They will be able to give that person reminders to come to court. We were able to be present to fill in the holes that the DA would probably use as a negative.
Sorry. If I'm not supposed to talk, just let me know, okay?
No, go for it, please.
I'm working on
talk.
4 hours of sleep here. So in my case, it actually did not go very well in the beginning. Besides the backlash of the actual community members who were not happy that I was testifying at the county commissioner's court or, making testimonies in front of the city council. What ended up happening was I received a lot of personal messages, and on the other half of that, Hayes County actually went into the system and erased the judge who was on my case. Now, I'm not sure what all the issues were behind that, but one day it was there, the next day it wasn't. so that I couldn't pull up proof. What they didn't know is I had already gotten the proof, but they, they were trying to erase bits and pieces that were connected to my name because I was doing a lot of talking in public. I was happy to do a lot of talking in public, but one thing I tell everyone, especially if you are going to be organizing or in a position of trying to get your local folks to tell their stories, which is really what's going to help move, the data is great, storytelling better, right? If you're going to get people to share their testimonies about their experiences in the county, in the city with, with their folks, it's really important that you try to find some sort of mental health support services for them. Try to make sure that you are compensating them for their time in any way that you can. Don't ask them to come do an interview and then not pay for the Lyft drive to get them there. Please make sure that you are providing food and housing if you can, or support with those, just some sort of additional support, because telling that story ended up putting me in front of the county commissioner's court. And I shared some things that I'm not happy that I shared at this point, but it's now in video and it's now on an official documentary testimony, and it's in places I didn't necessarily want it to be, and it could affect other people who are close to me. And so if you're going to ask people to share their testimonies, which you should, please make sure you're taking care of them on all fronts and not just using them for your campaign. Please do work the campaign, let them know how important it is, but also take care of them. That's also a part of all the work that we're doing. So I want to make sure I said that.
Faylita, can I ask you a little bit more about how you began telling your story after your experience with pretrial incarceration? Like, obviously, we saw the number earlier: 10 million people every year are incarcerated pretrial, and not everyone gets to the point where they do or can tell their story. Like, how did you get to the point where you felt comfortable or empowered to be somebody who's writing publicly and speaking at panels like this about pretrial incarceration?
Yeah, I never wanted to. It was definitely not at all I never connected what happened to me to mass incarceration. Never in my mind did I connect the two until 2019. It was just in my brain, I was like, nope, I'm not a part of the mass incarceration. That wasn't me. I was pretrial, not understanding just how pretrial is the doorway into everything. This is the root of so much, right? Folks think that, a weekend in jail can't change your life, but it literally can. You can lose your job, you can lose your car, you can lose your house, you can, miss an appointment, you can miss out on so many things with just those few nights in a jail pretrial. My case was specific to my city. I was a single queer Black femme, and I had just experienced the death of my fiance when I went in, and I spent 45 days in, which wouldn't be so crazy if it wasn't for a bounce $25 check I wrote when I was a sophomore in college and poor and literally sleeping on people's couches. And somebody asked me to share that at a local gathering. And I did. And then I started reading all the other stories of people who had experienced, pretrial incarceration. And I was like, oh, that would explain why I'm afraid to go to this street that has this cop on this corner. It would explain why I can't go to that grocery store anymore. It would explain all of the trauma I was already experiencing a decade after the fact. And understanding that what happened to me was something that was important enough to talk about, and that I had a job to do, even if it wasn't for everyone, it was at least local. And so through the local organization that I work with, I was able to connect with national organizations. And I'm a writer. I was already a writer. But understanding and putting together that the stories that I'm telling about my life and the stories that I'm telling about my experiences actually have more meaning and purpose outside of myself. That it's not just like, look what happened to me, but like, this is what happened. Here's how it can change. And this is a job I have as a writer now, is to help widen the scope of what's possible through storytelling, understanding that testimony is what puts a face to all the numbers and all the quotes and all the data, right? When I tell you that Sandra Bland, for Sandra Bland's case, that it was under $5,000 was what the bill was set at. And within 3 days, she was dead. right, for a traffic infraction. It was literally it was a traffic infraction. It wasn't even a major one, right? It wasn't like speeding. It was like, didn't use a turn signal, which is something we all do. And that's someone who went to school with my fiance. So I was on that campus. I was there when Sandra was there. And so my story isn't just my story. It's a story of what happens to my community and everyone around me. It could be anyone at any given time. And so me putting those two things together in 2019 really just kind of helped me change the outlook and perspective. I always wanted to advocate for others, but now I understood that I was also advocating for myself, and that it's within my right to say, no, I don't want this for my life anymore. And I don't want this for the people in my life. And I don't want this for the people in my life are interacting with. I don't want this for anyone anymore. And so, yeah, that's kind of how all of that fell out. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all that. And you ended on like a hopeful, positive note of, not wanting that for the people in your life. And I'm wondering what you, Faylita, you, Imani, and Kia and Alora, you too, see as sort of hopeful things on the policy horizon. Like, what are the changes that you see on the horizon that could and should be made?
I really am hoping that bill just it's a false barrier. I think that a major shift of financial support is going to, and financial and legislative, but when I think of financial, I think legislative anyways. Financial support is going to have to swing from defense to offense. Let's move it from, this problem has happened, let's fix it, to let's prevent this problem from happening in the first place, right? Make sure people are housed, make sure people have food, make sure people have support and mental health services. And do you know how many different crimes would be, prevented? And I say crimes in quotations because crimes are only crimes because somebody else decided that they were, not because they actually are, right? That was a decision that was made by someone else based off of a story that they told themselves and others for a long time. If we can change the narrative and make it, we made sure that everybody had everything they needed. And so if something's happened, it's probably because they didn't have something they needed, as opposed to, it's their own fault they don't have everything, and I'm not going to give it to them ever, right? If we can change that narrative perspective, I think it would change a lot of policy. And by policy, I mean the quality of people's lives would change.
I'm hoping that we move to a more restorative policy, and it does go, instead of like risk assessment, we're doing needs assessments. And if there is some type of harm or so-called crime, that we move to a more restorative approach of how do we correct that, how allowing a space for that, Walmart here, if you get caught shoplifting like 2 times, it's considered burglary, right? Why are we not able to assist people in like figuring out what's going on, and then giving them a way to restore that, it's merchandise, right? But you're giving the old woman that took food a felony charge. So I would love to see in policy restorative ways so that we can deal with combat this punitive system.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think sort of talking about restorative justice and restorative methods is something that maybe sometimes get lost when we have these conversations about systems change, because it's something that, at least to a certain degree, is so individualized. Another question we have, and maybe we can start with you, Imani, is in your work doing participatory defense, I guess this is sort of 2 questions. One is, what has surprised you the most about watching bail hearings in Knox County? And also, what are some common misconceptions that you see in the public about bail and pretrial detention?
So what has surprised me the most is just the variance. Like, we could listen to one case and they'll get a $50 bail, and then you can listen to another case similar in the same, felony or misdemeanor court, and they have this astronomical bail. So there's no rhyme or reason as to why they're setting these prices. And I think that's one of the holes that we're seeing that we might feel like we can challenge. What was the other question? I'm sorry.
If there are any sort of common misconceptions that you think the public has about bail and pretrial detention.
Yeah, they feel like it keeps them safe. And I feel like along with the storytelling that we are just losing that battle of narrative, right? Because we all know the stats do not show that incarcerated people pretrial, mass incarceration does not make us safe. But in people's mind, that is the only thing that they have been fed and taught. So they believe that. So when I tell someone, like you don't have to give someone bail, you could just give them a summons or a cite to come to court. They kind of think about it. And I'm like, if they can pay that bail, they're going to be out anyway. So that's not going to, if you think that's going to keep you safe, then why are they giving bail in the first place? And so they feel like there's a safety issue with bail. And I'm like, it's actually not, it's just about money and profit.
Absolutely. I don't know if Faylita, if you want to say more to answer that question, or Laura and Kia, if you have anything to add.
I've actually never been able to do any watching from inside, primarily because I get triggered. I'm emotional, and so it's already hard to sit and watch it happen to others. All that being said, I think what is kind of interesting is that there is more understanding that it's everybody who's affected by pretrial, as in almost every single person in North America knows somebody who's been in a jail cell at least one night. It doesn't matter the class, it doesn't matter the race. It's kind of like everybody's got somebody, whether it's your coworker or it's your, your doctor, or, it's always somebody and somebody. And once you get to that level of over policing, once you get to that level of everybody has been taken in for something, you had a drunk night, or, you walked across the street. Once you start putting together that almost all of the hashtag say names folks were for misdemeanor charges that were citation eligible, like bail wouldn't have been. Once you start putting all that together, I think that changes the narrative. And so what I feel like I'm seeing more often is people going, that don't make sense. No, really, that doesn't make any sense. I think TikTok, and I keep talking about social media's impact on social justice. I'm going to continue to do that. TikTok is a very interesting place because so many people are going into these deep, dark holes, and they're like going through case files, and they're like doing it in a short and interesting way and educating the next generation on the issues that we've been trying to get in front of their faces forever, but in a more in-depth and relatable way, which means that the next generation is actually slightly more informed than even my generation was, because they have access to that information on a regular basis, and it's coming with a song, and it's coming with context, and here's the 1 minute, everything you need to know about this issue real quick, and here's how you can get involved, and here are the links. Right. And I think that is in and of itself interesting, that I can go and follow a number of organizers from around the country and learn a lot about an issue I don't know a lot about, and be able to share that information. And so I think the narratives are changing. And even though it may not be evident all the way at the top, I think it's coming. And that's what gives me joy. And that's what gives me encouragement, is knowing that it's coming. So.
Changing gears a little bit, somebody in the audience has a question. They were excited by something Imani said about moving away from risk assessment models, and they're wondering if you, Imani, or I know, or if any of the panelists have thoughts about risk assessment algorithms and their role in pretrial detention and mass incarceration, and wants to talk more about it. Somebody is interested in hearing more about the harms that risk assessment algorithms cause.
I'll let somebody else go first.
I can talk a little bit about risk assessment algorithms and how they've operated in Harris County, Texas. And which is kind of indicative of how they operate around the country, which is that people are creating algorithms to predict how unsafe a person is or how violent a person is. And it's all based on an algorithm, not based on what the person has actually done. And the algorithm, even though it might sound like an algorithm would be maybe more just because it's math, maybe it sounds more fair. But it's not, because people are creating the math, people are creating the algorithm. And so the biases of the people creating the algorithm show up. So an example of that is that in some algorithms, there will be something that says, oh, if people are from this zip code, then they're more likely to be dangerous or more likely to commit a crime. And the problem with that is, first of all, there's a lot of problems with that. The main problems with that are that we live in a country that has actively segregated people into different neighborhoods. And so zip codes are the result of racism. The composition of certain zip codes are the result of structural racism. On top of that, certain zip codes are over policed also because of racism. And so perhaps they say, oh, if you're from this zip code, you're more dangerous because there's more police activity happening there. But that's kind of a chicken or egg issue where it's like, well, there's more police activity happening there because you put more police there, not because people are more dangerous. And so you can see how these algorithms create issues and lead to people being put in cages based on the biases of whoever created the algorithm versus what's actually happening in reality.
And as far as like the needs assessment, it's not going into like, what are the risks of them so-called reoffending? It's about, let's see if we can meet some of the needs of why this person is in this position in the first place. Like, for instance, the elderly woman who was shoplifting at Walmart, she needed food, right? So if we can meet that needs, she would never have been in that situation. If there's mental health issues, let's set this person up with social services to see what's going on. If there's some type of, fear of violence or whatever that is, let's get them to some community partners that work on those issues. And let's focus on the needs of the people instead of their risk or so-called risk of reoffending. That can look a lot of different ways. We primarily focus on those social needs: housing, transportation, food, things that the DA may argue against letting someone out. They're like, if they're going to come back to court, it was like, okay, well, we will stand in place and say this person will come back to court. And this is how we will stand in place. We will provide them transportation. We will give them text reminders. They will come to our meetings weekly, just creating those needs assessments and then trying to find, if your organization can't fill them, partnering with other organizations that can fill them, and then presenting that to the pretrial officers.
Yeah, that sounds lovely, to be honest. That sounds like sounds lovely. I'm thinking of the Vera Institute calculator, and I only had a little bit to play with it and to kind of gauge its effectiveness. I know that there was at one point another needs assessment type calculator that was being created, or at least like was being theorized, of how would you determine the needs and potential of this person to be able to afford bail in the first place. Before you set it, how do you determine they can even pay this? Like, what's the standard that you're setting for that? And that was the only kind of sample I had seen. This is why I'm interested in what you're talking about, Imani, because I know that there is also like another survey that existed, and if anything, it felt like it wasn't thorough enough. That being said, I'm thinking about the very real part of it is that you come in at a time where you're not expecting to be there in the first place, and you're asked to fill out this 15-page questionnaire about whether or not you should be there. Like, that's feels unrealistic and unsustainable. And so finding something that is sustainable feels important. I do want to say that the risk assessment that is determining whether or not someone will reoffend feels a lot like playing tarot cards, for I'm a tarot card reader, and so I can say this with, like, without any bias of being like, you can't predict the future, buddy. You're trying so hard to predict the future, and you really cannot predict the future based off of the set of circumstances I have, because one thing could change and that would change the outcome for me, right? Like Imani is saying, if you provide me food, I won't have to go and steal it. That simple, right? If you provide a way for me to afford my house, I won't have to like be in this space that you don't want me in front of your business. It's that simple, right? And so you cannot protect the future with that. And so I find it very interesting that they're trying so hard to make it seem like it's legit, and it's not based in any sort of reality that makes sense. So it's my 2 cents.
Yeah, one more thing I would add too is that you can also expand the needs to those who are around you. Like if you're the primary caregiver, right? And so if this person is locked up for X amount of days, their children need them, that's a need. And so you can also display like what will be missing from that child's life. Will their school be affected? Will their, health be affected? If you're a caregiver for, an elderly person, those are also needs that you can put in that needs assessment.
One question I have, Faylita, you're writing about really personal, individualized experiences and doing a lot of work on the ground locally in parts of Texas. And Imani, you're thinking about individuals' needs on a case-by-case basis and organizing in one community in East Tennessee. And I'm wondering how you both think about your work, sort of balancing these really local needs that specific communities or people have with the idea of a national movement for abolition or for get the abolition of bail. Like, is that something that you're thinking about on a daily basis, or how do you see your work on a local level in relationship or not in relationship with national political movements?
I was gonna go first because I wanted to let it end on a concrete note from Imani. That sounds like, and I say that because I had to make a really hard, tough decision, and I made it more than once over the last few years of moving from the day-to-day of groundwork at the local level to focusing on the creative work. And what that means, the difference between it is like, I can't come to the rally. I'm not going to be there at every meeting on Tuesday. I am going to have a hard time showing up at the monthly things. I have several poems in which I talk about the way my emails are set up, because I have so many emails that I receive, and it's not just from the local organization. It's every wonderful organization I've had the wonderful opportunity to come into contact with, plus all of their current needs, right? So I'm getting messages about people needing housing. I'm getting messages about so-and-so needs to get out right now. So-and-so needs support. So-and-so has passed. It's a constant barrage of information at the local and national level. And for my mental health and to do the work that I think I've been asked to do, not just by people, but by the spirit, right? And by the ancestors and by my community members, what I feel like I need to do is I need to sit down, do the research, and create something. And I need to dream. And it's very hard to dream when all I'm surrounded by is all of the pain and the ugly. When I received the information from CRC, I had to take a whole day. It took a whole day of grief. I was grieving for a whole day so that I could sit down and get some words out to you in a way that made sense, in a way that was, digestible for you. In order for any movement to move forward, I think it's important that we tell our stories, and we need somebody who has the time and the space to sit down and do that, and who has the fortitude to say the really true things that are hard to say. And for me, that's what I'm trying to get to as a writer right now. I'm literally trying to say, all right, time to take off all the expectations of deadlines and publishers and approval from all the people that you work with, and say the hard thing that no one else wants to say because it's hard and because it could get you killed or because it could put you down in history as something ugly or mean. Like, what is the real thing I need to say underneath all of this, even if it's not accepted in my lifetime? Right. And so that's what I'm in the process of doing. That's what my job is right now, is to listen, to learn, to hear, and to meet the people, to gather the stories, digest them, so that I can then write them down and get them out, and hopefully inspire the next round of folks who will do the work.
And I just want to say that work is very important, those stories, and being able to, say that, a lot of times people they are afraid to tell their stories. So thank you so much for everything you're doing and the way that you do it, and it's received. I just want to say that actually our COVID was started by a story. We recorded a phone call of a man who kept calling us saying, I don't want to die in here. I don't want to die. I can't afford, and it was breaking our hearts. And we were like, hey, do you mind if we record this? He was like, I would do anything to get out of here. He said, I want to be out of here for my children. I don't think I'm going to, he said, I'm in here and I'm not sentenced to die. But he was like, I might die in here. And when people heard that, they were like, what is going on? Like, I think that's what created that movement, was that story that he was boldly willing to tell. I think our local work has sparked statewide work, because now they're like, well, let's just do what Knoxville's doing, because we have the data, right? The shows like, you can just give people, pretrial release, and, it's not going to be this influx of crime, which I hope that nationally people can use the data. I think everywhere that we can gather data and we can show, this is working, like the examples that were given in the presentation, that's going to affect national work.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and it's been really amazing to see the way that in Tennessee, people are starting to see how things are working in Knoxville and implement change elsewhere because of that. We're running out of time, so we just have one last question for the two of you. And again, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your wisdom and your thoughts on organizing and on pretrial detention with us. This has been really amazing, and thank you to everybody who asked questions. Our last question is just, when you're doing this work, what sustains you and what brings you hope?
I'm going to go with the one. I'm actually in Chicago now. I've moved to Chicago after 20-something years in Texas. And so one of the things that I said in front of the county commissioner's court that I was embarrassed about was how I had to make a decision to place my child for adoption a year and a half after I was in pretrial incarceration, because if I couldn't afford to feed myself, how could I afford to take care of someone else? And so I currently live 15 minutes away from my child. Her parents are my friends, and she is turning 10 on the 24th. And a decade later,
Faylita, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we can't hear you.
am I gone? Okay, how about now? Can you guys hear me? Okay. She's 15 minutes away. She's turning 10 on October 24th. I have had the wonderful opportunity to babysit her a couple of times. Her parents are my friends. And after a decade of all the things that have come since the arrest, it's been 12 years. I have learned that it's not just for me, it's for her family, it's for her, right? It's one thing to do it for myself, but it's exciting that there is a kid who has a different life, and who I see now what it all is for, right? The hope and the goal. that she gets to be just as weird as she wants to without anybody stopping her for watching anime or for, you know, hanging out in the park. I'm in South Side of Chicago, right? And so I get to be around and in her life, and I get to dream up what a kind of a beautiful life she could have. And that's literally my job now, is to dream about all the good things that I could bring to her life. And so that's pretty cool and pretty exciting to be here during this time. Yeah.
I'm gonna say the people for both answers. You know, when I get depressed about, you know, an outcome, or I get frustrated and angry, it's a lot of times what I feel. You have people and families who encourage me in ways they don't even know. Just yesterday, I got a call from prison and I was frustrated about something. And he was like, well, sister, you can't give up. You know, we are dependent on you in here, and you don't know how much, you know, we talk about the work that you're doing in here, and it gives people hope. And, you know, one thing he said, he was like, you know, you're not scared to fight against this. He was like, a lot of people are scared to do this. And he was like, if you stop doing it, then, you know, who do we turn to? And, you know, that just re-energized me for another day. And sometimes I need that, you know, that motivation every hour. You know, this work is very hard. You have to guard your heart, because you will burn out. And sometimes it's okay too to say, no, I can't do it today. I can't do it this month, you know, to like recharge yourself. So also what gives me hope are the people, you know. When I see, you know, when I envision a community in a world where, you know, my nephew that's part-time staying with me, you know, he isn't targeted. You know, I know that's what I'm working towards. I know that I'm working for a world where he and his children can grow up and be free in the literal sense and figuratively in everything, in the way they move, in the way, like you said, you know, the way they dress, whatever. They're not going to be a target. They're not going to be the new slaves where prisons are making money off of their bodies. So the people for both answers.
Again, thank you so much, Faylita and Imani. That was really an amazing panel, and I feel really hopeful heading out of it. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Ben, for facilitating that Q&A, and Imani, Faylita, thank you both so much for your time and for sharing your experiences with us. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Alora and Kia for your presentation. Again, our panelists, and Ben for facilitating, my colleagues, Tara and Cheryl, who put a ton of work into organizing this evening's event. We really hope that you all found this to be a valuable few hours. Please do feel free to send any follow-up questions, comments, or feedback. The best email address to use is media@civilrightscorps.org. And we hope to see you all soon. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful, safe evening.